The Safe Sanctuary Protection Policy of Laingsburg United Methodist Church is designed with one intention in mind: to provide a safe space for everyone placed in our care, even for those who are tasked with providing such care and love to those God has called us to nurture. For this purpose, this protection policy will be utilized in all Laingsburg UMC programs and ministries involving babies, children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Before we continue with the training, let me take just a moment to thank you for your willingness to participate in this process. The process is designed not only to ensure the protection of all babies, children, youth, and vulnerable adults, as well as to ensure that those who are working with God's children are safe, responsible, and trained. But it is also to provide assurance to the broader Laingsburg community that we take our commitment to the care for all of God's children very seriously. Let us always remember the promises we, as a congregation, make to those being baptized. With God's help, we will proclaim the good news and live according to the example of Christ. We will surround these persons with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their trust of God and be found faithful in their service to others. We pray for them that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that leads to life. Through the procedures of this policy, we are ensuring that we are fulfilling all aspects of this promise. Now, let's take a look at one commonly asked question when it comes to this policy. Is it really necessary? After all, we're a church full of Christians, right? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, it is necessary. Too often we find it is in churches that incidents of impropriety between children and adults take place. In some cases, this can be the result of malicious attempts to harm a child, while in other cases, it's simply a lack of boundaries or even a failure to properly supervise those entrusted to our care. I can tell you that this policy is not a result of any incident in our congregation, nor are its intentions to elevate any fears that something could happen. Just the opposite, the protection policy is a result of proactive efforts made to ensure that we won't ever experience such incidents. Turning to the protection policy itself, let's begin by looking at some of the terminology we'll be using throughout the training. Please know that you can always find these terms and their definitions in your copy of the protection policy provided along with this training video. An activity is the event or activity that is sponsored by the church in its entirety. Examples include, but are not limited to, Vacation Bible School, Sunday School, youth group overnights, etc. An activity begins when the first individual is signed in, and it does not include until every individual who has been signed in is properly signed out. A worker is defined as any person who serves as an employee, volunteer, and/or is financially compensated. The individual must also be at least 18 years of age or older. Some examples include Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, pastors, etc. A helper is any youth, adult volunteer, or visitor who assists the policy-trained workers, but is not certified. This is often the case in scenarios such as with a youth volunteer during Vacation Bible School, or a guest speaker for a children's program. In such cases, the helper is to be supervised just as the baby, child, youth participants. They are not considered supervisors under the two-worker rule. This is important and will be further explained later in the training. A parent here refers to the legal parent and/or guardian of a baby, child, or youth, such as the grandfather with legal custody of his granddaughter. Then there is the non-legal guardian, who is anyone other than a parent who has been designated as a responsible party for the baby, child, or youth. The most common example of this is a family friend or a neighbor who is asked to drop off or pick up a child. An adult is defined as anyone age 18 and older, whereas a baby is defined for the purpose of this policy as anyone birth to 36 months of age or their third birthday, whichever is easier for you to remember. A child is anyone 36 months or 3 years old through and including the 5th grade. A youth is considered to be anyone in the 6th grade through the 12th grade and less than 18 years of age. It's important to note that the age of the youth is worth considering. Once they are 18 years of age, they technically are considered adults, according to our definition, though they still are in high school potentially. Remember, even though they are an adult technically, this does not mean that they are policy trained, though they are welcome to become policy trained and certified. And so for the purposes of programming, 18-year-old high schoolers will, in most cases, still be treated and supervised as youth during activities. Finally, a vulnerable person is defined as an individual who, because of age, developmental disability, mental illness, or physical handicap, requires supervision or personal care, or lacks the personal and social skills required to live independently. Certainly, this definition leaves quite a bit to subjective interpretation. Just remember, when determining if someone should be regarded as a vulnerable adult, our purpose is to ensure the safety of those God has entrusted to our care. Being on the safe side is always preferable. Now let's take some time to look at the various safe sanctuary practices contained in the policy. To do this, we'll focus on information that every trained worker will need to know and practice on a regular basis. While there is much information contained in the policy with regard to more infrequent circumstances and roles, we'll simply encourage you to read through the policy, particularly sections D through L, which pertain to actions, discipline, and other things that you will need to know for the actual practice and care of children. The first practice that we'll look at is the most foundational to the supervision and care of all babies, children, youth, and vulnerable adults. We referenced it before, and it is called the two-worker rule. The purpose of the two-worker rule is to ensure that there are an appropriate number of adults to supervise those in the worker's care. To ensure this, there is to be, during every activity, a minimum of 2 certified workers present with all participants. Put another way, you will never be expected or allowed to care for participants by yourself without another policy-certified worker. It is also important to note that all workers must be at least 5 years older than the oldest youth. For example, it would be inappropriate for a 20-year-old worker to be one of 2 supervisors for high school youth. If you should ever find yourself without a second worker, be sure to let the supervisor or pastor know without delay. Additionally, it is important to ensure that you're positioning you and the participants in your care in the safest places possible. Be sure that rooms where you're gathering have at least one window door, and ideally several other windows. If, for some reason, this is not possible, be sure to leave the door open. A good guideline is to make sure that if anyone wanted to know what is happening in the room, they could do so without much effort. Finally, with regard to the two-worker rule, be sure to avoid being one-on-one with a participant in a secluded fashion. For example, if a child needs to be spoken to about a behavior issue, don't do this in the hallway where you will be alone with the child. Instead, walk with the child to a corner of the room to speak with them in view and earshot of the other worker present. The only time when one-on-one interaction is appropriate is in the case of pastoral counseling with children or youth. During this time, the pastor will take care to maintain transparency, such as a room with windows, etc. When discussing the topic of supervision, it is also important to talk about the topic of touch. We know that touch and physical touch are important elements in developing healthy and appropriate relationships, especially among adolescents. However, it's important to know what forms of touch are appropriate and what forms are inappropriate. Examples of appropriate touch include, but are not limited to, brief hugs, hand pats on the shoulder or upper back, handshakes, high fives, and holding hands while walking with small children or praying. Examples of inappropriate touch include, but again are not limited to, inappropriate or lengthy hugs, kisses on the mouth, holding school-aged children on the lap, touching bathing suit areas for purposes other than diapering or toileting infants and toddlers, tickling children or youth, and adult to minor or minor to adult massages. Please note that some forms of inappropriate touch, such as lap sitting and tickling, may have at one point been considered appropriate and acceptable forms of touch. However, to ensure healthy boundaries and possible misinterpretation being avoided, it is best to remain on the safe side. In the event that inappropriate touch does occur, with or without intent and regardless of who initiated the touch, it is essential that it not be ignored. By identifying and notifying the activity director and/or pastor, you are ensuring that there is no perception of impropriety or an attempt to hide an inappropriate action. As we conclude the topic of supervision, it is necessary to note that there are two exceptions to the two-worker rule. First, and the baby, child, or youth is being supervised by their own parent or legal guardian, a second worker is not required, regardless of whether they are policy trained and certified or not. However, if there are other unrelated children present, the two-worker rule does apply. This is often the case if a parent or legal guardian comes during the church activity to administer medication or otherwise care for their own child, grandchild, etc. A second situation in which the two-worker rule is not required is in the case of an emergency when a second worker has to be away from the group for that emergency. For example, if during an activity there is a medical emergency and the second worker needs to go to receive medical attention, the participants will remain with the one remaining worker. In this case, it would be important for the remaining worker to ensure as much transparency as possible. They may choose to do outdoors activities, call another worker to come, and/or provide periodic check-ins with the pastor by telephone. One other time when you may have an alternative style to the two-worker rule is in the case where you have one worker present in a classroom and another worker who moves between another room and yours. This is appropriate because it still maintains transparency and the willingness to have another worker present at all times. One reality for caring for babies, children, and youth in a church activity setting is that the participant is placed in your care. This means that you are responsible for their health, well-being, as well as overseeing their behavior during the duration of the activity. For this reason, we will now take a look at the topic of discipline. If a child or youth is behaving inappropriately, it is important that you communicate to them specifically what it is they are doing that is not acceptable and state what correct behavior you do expect. This does not require a raised or aggressive voice. In fact, a lower volume and calm demeanor will influence their behavior to do the same. If this conversation is not effective and the behavior continues, the child or youth will be guided to another task or perhaps even a table of their own to work, rest, or participate at away from the other participants for a short time. Be sure that while they are separated, that they remain under proper supervision under the two-worker rule. If the disruptive behavior of the child or youth continues after these steps have been taken, you should immediately notify the pastor. The pastor will then talk with the participant and work with their parents and/or guardians to find a solution to the behavior. In all of this, there is to be no physical or verbal abuse or punishment used to discipline a child or youth. Now let's take time to review the process for a child to be dropped off, signed in, and finally signed out and released. When a parent, guardian, or non-legal guardian brings a baby, child, youth, or vulnerable adult for a church activity, they will always be asked to sign the participant into the program. This will be done on the sign-in sheet for the particular activity. These sign-in sheets are available in each program space for you to use, along with a copy of the Safe Sanctuary Protection Policy and other necessary forms. When signing the participant in, the parent or guardian will provide all information on the sheet that you can see here on the screen. This same form and the information provided will also be used at checkout. When a participant is leaving and is being checked out, we want to be absolutely sure that the individual is going with the right person. For this reason, the participant can only be released to individuals designated at checkout. Remember, just because the child knows the adult who is there to pick them up does not mean that they are allowed to pick that child up. If you do not know the individual who is designated for pickup, please ask nicely to see a photo ID. While this may feel awkward, it is absolutely essential for the protection of the child. From time to time, there may be activities that will take place away from the church campus and will require transportation. In these cases, only certified and policy-trained workers who are at least 21 years of age and possess a valid driver's license, as well as proof of insurance for a roadworthy vehicle, are permitted to provide transportation to children and youth. Those wishing to be able to transport children and youth to in their vehicle must provide the church office with a photocopy of their driver's license, as well as proof of the insurance. Furthermore, when driving and transporting participants, all state vehicular laws are to be observed. While the two-worker rule may be difficult to abide by when multiple vehicles are being used to transport activity participants, it can be sufficiently accomplished through a caravan style of driving, maintaining regular contact via telephone or two-way radios. Again, the important thing is to remain transparent in all that you do. With increasing technology, including camera phones capable of both video and still photographs, as well as the church's wish to utilize videos and photos for social media, our website, and other means of outreach and communication, it is important that permission is obtained from a parent or legal guardian before pictures of babies, children, or youth taken during activities are used in this manner. In the event that permission is not given, the participant's photo are not to be used for these or any other purpose. Finally, we turn to a difficult subject, though one that is absolutely necessary for providing safe space for all of God's children. The reporting of abuse or suspected abuse of a baby, child, or youth, or vulnerable adult is something we are charged with, in some cases by law, but always by our Christian convictions. If you know or even suspect that abuse is taking place, whether on site or elsewhere, such as at a child's home, a relative's home, etc., it is essential that you report your suspicions to the pastor. Do not wait. It is not your job to investigate, nor is it the pastor's job. It is not your job to ask questions or doubt someone's claim to being abused. Instead, it is our job to simply report it. When you notify the pastor will make a verbal report to the Michigan Department of Human Services. Your help will be needed to make this report. While you may feel like this was an overreaction, especially when it is suspected abuse, it is not an overreaction. It is an important step in making sure that everyone is safe and cared for. However, there are a couple of things that you will want to know that may help you do this task well. If a child or youth tells you they are being abused, it is important that you believe them. They are trusting you with something very important and likely something very painful to them. You can feel good about that. Assure them that you want to help. You may even encourage them to help you speak to the pastor. Whether a child or youth reports it to you, or you suspect it, you are not to share this information with anyone else, including other workers, parents, and guardians. Only the pastor. When making a report, you may be asked to give your name. However, this is a confidential report. Your name will be kept confidential as well. Regardless of what action the Michigan Department of Human Services takes, if any, it is not uncommon to not be notified of the specifics of the decisions or actions. While this can be difficult and even frustrating, you can trust that due diligence was made by the necessary authorities. Finally, please don't feel guilty or allow yourself to be made to feel guilty for reporting information about or the suspicion of abuse. This is an act of love that must be taken, and doing it might just save a life in ways you'll never know. Finally, as we draw to an end of this training, allow me to repeat my words of appreciation for your willingness to participate in this training and policy certification. Once you are done viewing this video training, you will need to complete the participation covenant provided to you. If one was not provided to you, one can be printed from the file on this CD. By completing and signing this form, you are confirming that you have taken this training, understand the material, practices, and requirements contained in this policy. Should you have any additional questions or need clarification, please be sure to ask the pastor or policy coordinator as soon as possible. Once you've completed the participation covenant form, please return it along with this disc to the church office. The copy of the Safe Sanctuary Protection Policy that accompanied this training CD is yours to keep for reference and further study. Lastly, let us take time to read once more the promise we make at baptism, and in doing so, remember why it is important that we are embarking on this ministry in the first place. With God's help, we will proclaim the good news and live according to the example of Christ. We will surround these persons with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their trust of God and be found faithful in their service to others. We will pray for them, that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that leads